Very good evening and welcome to all the participants to this 65th leadership conversation. We are extremely delighted to have Ms. Suhasini Haidar as our speaker this evening. Ma'am, good evening and welcome. We also have Professor Prasad. Good evening and welcome, Professor Prasad.
Evening.
What we do now is I will do a brief intro of the guest and then hand it over very quickly back to her so that she can initiate the opening remarks. And after that, we are ready for the Q&A. So allow me to share my screen. So ladies and gentlemen, I take pleasure in introducing our esteemed guest, Ms. Suhasini Haidar. Welcome to this WiseViews Leadership Conversations. We have been holding these conversations every Friday in the evening around 4 p.m. And this is the 65th in the series. Today, we have Ms. Suhasini, who's going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, assessing India's policy and the impact of the conflict on global economy. The agenda is pretty simple. The opening remarks will be delivered in about 30 minutes or so, and followed by the Q&A in the next 30 minutes. This is a 1-hour session, and sometimes generally, based on the response, we have extended it by 10-15 minutes beyond 5 p.m. This is Ms. Suhasini, and she's the diplomatic editor of The Hindu. She regularly writes on foreign policy issues and hosts a weekly online show called WorldView with Suhasini Haidar. She held various positions. Prior to this, she was foreign affairs editor and primetime anchor for India's leading 24-hour English news channel CNN-IBM from 2005 to 2014. And a correspondent for CNN International's New Delhi bureau before that. Over the course of her 28-year reporting career, Ms. Suhasini has covered the most challenging stories and conflicts from the most diverse regions, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Libya, Lebanon, and Syria. In India, she has covered the foreign affairs beat for over a decade, and her domestic assignments include political profiles and in-depth reportage from conflict zones, including Kashmir, where she was injured in a bomb blast in 2000. Regularly covers Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visits abroad, including to US, China, UK, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Israel, etc. She recorded special interviews with Prime Minister Modi, who was then the Chief Minister of Gujarat in the year 2009, and family of former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, former Pakistan President General Musharraf and his wife and mother, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair and wife Cherry Blair. Regularly covers Pakistan and has reported on all major events from the Benazir Bhutto assassination and Pakistan elections in 1997, 2007, and 2013. She's the only woman on board Indian naval warship evacuating Indians from Lebanon in 2006. Wow. She traveled to Hezbollah-controlled areas as well. Very risky. She won several awards. In the 2018 Haldi Ghati Award, Maharana Mewar Foundation Award for Best Journalist. In 15, Prem Bhatia Award for Best Journalist, Diplomatic and International Affairs Reporting. 2014, People of the Year, Limca Book of Records. Again, the same year, Best TV News Presenter, NT Awards. In 2009, again, NT Award, Best Chart Show for Children's Day at the 7 Racecourse Road. A special interview with the former Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh and Mrs. Gurshan Kaur. Very impressive, ma'am. She earned a bachelor's degree at the prestigious Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi and then completed her master's in broadcast journalism at Boston University's College of Communication, USA. She currently lives in Delhi with her family. So this is the brief introduction to a very, very impressive person that we have with us. So I will also introduce Professor Prasad. Professor Prasad is the director for academic wing. He is also the mentor and professor for the online MBA program. He brings to the table a rich experience of 3 decades, comprising the corporate world, in the world of academics, and much before that, he was an entrepreneur himself. All put together, 3 decades of experience. Most welcome, Professor Prasad, to this conversation. I would quickly request ma'am, Suhasini ma'am, to start her opening remarks, and we will all be, I'm sure all the participants are now settled and they are eagerly waiting to hear you, ma'am. We have been waiting to hear you for a couple of weeks now, and we got this opportunity. Thank you so much, and over to you. Once again, thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Rao, and thank you to the ICFAI for being so patient. I can only apologize for not having been able to join you a few weeks ago, but it was, believe it or not, one of the outcomes of the Russia-Ukraine war, because there was the Indonesian President, Joko Widodo, who is going to host the G20 summit this year, had gone to visit actually Kiev and Moscow, to start up the conversation on allowing food consignments to leave Russia and Ukraine, and had come back and decided he wanted to give this interview right away. I tried very hard to postpone it at the time, was not able to, and therefore I apologize, and I really apologize to the organizers. I'm very grateful that you didn't give up hope and have allowed me to come back to speak to all of you. Now, I understand that our audience today is a group of extremely well-qualified financial analysts, people who are dealing with the finances of the nation on a day-to-day basis. What I want to speak about today are slightly broader terms in terms of what we call now geoeconomics. Everything has a catchword, everything has a catchphrase these days. Take you through the facts of what has happened. It seems hard to believe because, you know, we've gotten used to being in tough times. I think for the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen nothing but tough times, and prognosis has been gloom and doom for a while. So to take you through what has happened only in 6 months, because if you look from February this year to we're getting into August now, it is 6 months since the Russia-Ukraine war began. Russia began its invasion on Ukraine and continues to carry out bombardment there even today. So the way I'm going to sort of just arrange this entire talk, because I don't actually have a PowerPoint, because I try to stay away from PowerPoints. I think it's difficult as it is on a Zoom when you're not really seeing me face to face to keep looking away to a screen. But for those of you who like to have things in, in a kind of way that they can remember, everything I will tell you will come in point form. And if you have a paper and pen or you want to use your laptop next to you, please continue to do so. So what has happened since February 24th? Really 5 major things have happened which affect the world. The first has been Russia's unilateral invasion of Ukraine. There are other ways to put it. Russia would prefer limited operations as a term. The US and Europe have been much more brutal about the terms they have used. But at the end of the day, it was an invasion. It continues to be an invasion because we are seeing Russian jets continue to bomb cities of Ukraine. And annex land as well. We know that the eastern part of Ukraine is under Russian control at the moment. So what we have seen is a military action and a military invasion. The second thing, the second development since then have been the sanctions by the United States and the European Union. These are not identical. They work in tandem. The United States had one set of financial geoeconomic sanctions, which included sanctions against officials, sanctions against Putin's oligarchs, sanctions against the government. And then the US took a unilateral decision to ban the import of Russian oil. On the European Union side, they also carried out a number of sanctions. They couldn't cut off oil completely because of the European situation. So we've seen a number of other sanctions being taken out by the European Union in terms of cutting off its ties with Russia, in terms of trying to curtail Russia's access to funds in particular. So funds abroad have been frozen and a number of measures taken, for example, as you know, the SWIFT payment system, which Russia has been ousted from, and a freeze on currency as well. The third thing that we saw happen geoeconomically is multinational corporations, who are essentially Western, American, European. They decided unilaterally to pull out of Russia. Now, this has not happened before. Normally, what happens is countries or the United Nations decide to sanction a country, and therefore financial entities stop doing business there because it is not possible to do. In this case, we have seen companies from Coca-Cola to MasterCard to Hilton to, all kinds of services and goods basically shutting shop in Russia. Some of it has come from the idea that as the war progresses, it is going to become even more difficult to even salvage any of their assets. So some of them did it. But, when you look from one end, a company like JP Morgan shut down its office, to you look at the malls and McDonald's and retail stores, they have all unilaterally shut down in Russia. This is an inflection point really for the world. The fourth thing that happened was the snapping of people to people and trade and travel ties. So ordinarily, you cannot fly anymore in and out of Moscow and go to any of the countries that are part of the sanctions. And I should make the point that if you add the 29 countries of the European Union and you add US and its allies and people who have joined the sanctions regime like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and all the rest, you come to less than 40 countries. So there are 160 countries out there who are not part of the sanctions, but 60 that are. And they've stopped all kinds of things. Music has been stopped. We've heard of universities stopping the studying of Russian authors. We've heard of philharmonic orchestras that don't allow their conductors anymore because they are Russian. So a real snapping of people-to-people ties has occurred. And the fifth that has occurred is a polarization of multilateral organizations. So we are really seeing a shift. What do I mean by this? Whether it is in the United Nations, where we've seen a number of resolutions, and as you know, India has abstained on each of those. I'll come to the Indian position in just a bit. Or whether it is the Atomic Energy Agency, whether it is the IMF, we're seeing people refusing to even go to meetings where, say, the Europeans refuse to go to meetings where the Russians are speaking and vice versa. And this is all leading up, of course, to a big showdown possibly, which has been the big worry in the G20. Now, the G20 is, of course, the only grouping of its kind of the 20 top economies of the world, and they are expected to meet in November. The summit is expected to meet in November in Bali, in Indonesia. And it does seem for the moment that they are heading for some kind of a confrontation there itself between the leaders, because Mr. Putin has said he will actually attend the summit. This will be a first, because so far he's attending summits really with more friendly countries. This is the first time he'll come face to face with them, and America, Europe, Australia, other countries have said that they might actually boycott meetings where he is. So we're seeing a full polarization of the multilateral structure of the world. If these are the 5 things that have happened, and this is the part which I know I won't need to tell you too much about, what is the actual impact on the global economy? The first, everybody knows, is oil, Russia being one of the largest producers of oil. And the sanctions on Russian oil have meant that people are A, looking for other sources of oil, B, that they are actually beginning to have to, worry about the winter coming on, natural gas also diversify from. So obviously the price of oil is hovering around $100 per barrel. It may be a little less than that right now. It went much further up a couple of months ago. Certainly that is one of the big worries, because it is feeding into inflation. So that's the third impact, inflation and the hike in food prices. Now, those are often put together as the same thing, but there is an extra problem with food prices, because if you put Russia and Ukraine together, they in a combined manner account for about 20% of the wheat production. And if you look at that export market that Russia and Ukraine combined mean, for the last 6 months or since the harvest has been out, what we have seen is close to 250 million tons of food stock is lying either in Russia or in Ukraine. I think about 70 million tons is at Ukraine and the rest in Russia, which cannot be exported because the Ukrainian side has been blocked from exporting. Ships have been blocked from exporting by Russians. That's what they used to say. Russians claim also that they have put landmines around these ships so that they cannot move. Of course, as you know, about a week ago, the United Nations, Turkey came together and put together an agreement which has been signed now by Russia and Ukraine, and hopefully these food stocks are going to make their way to the international market. But in the meanwhile, as these food stocks were stuck and prices went up, countries began to worry about their own inflation and their own prices. Countries like India, which put an export ban on wheat, which India has had to explain in so many fora now at the WTO as well as bilaterally. Indonesia put a ban on palm oil, which they have now reversed. But that is the kind of impact you are seeing around the world. The third has been a drop in GDP growth. And you can't just blame the Russia-Ukraine economy for it, but this was supposed to be a year of recovery, or certainly some amount of recovery. But the IMF has just, as of today, put out a new perspective for the world. It expects the world economy to only grow by about 3.2% in 2022, slowing down to about 2.9% in 2023. So at least 0.4% lower than they had earlier thought. The fourth impact on the global economy has been on climate change commitments. Just last November, a few months before this war, the world was talking about moving away from fossil fuels, moving towards renewable energies. What is happening instead is a kind of hoarding mechanism has kicked in, where everybody is now once again putting their focus on how to access how to access fossil fuels. And the cost of reversing this trend is going to be felt in the future, because all of us have commitments for 2030, for 2050, for 2070. So the fourth one is that. The fifth is, of course, the knock-on effects, which we are feeling here in the region very closely. Remember, we've had those years of COVID. We've had years of an economic slowdown. Of course, China is at the forefront of that, and worries about the Chinese economy slowing down to its lowest speed levels this year are going to have an effect around the world. Finally, you bring in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and what you're seeing is a perfect storm. Any country that is dependent on exports or dependent on tourism or dependent on imports has been affected extra badly. I mean, what we're seeing now in Sri Lanka is really a microcosm, because Sri Lanka was a country that was already being badly managed economically. And then you cut off the tourism, you cut off the exports because there's no currency there, and you cut off the agricultural production inside the country. Sri Lanka is also a country that's dependent on imports, like even for milk powder. So a country like that completely could not handle it and is now bankrupt. For us in India, we need to watch not only the mistakes that other countries have made, but the kinds of ways in which what we had seen as a positive trend, and of course, globalization is a positive trend, is actually becoming the cause of the problem. At one point, because of when COVID was spreading, everyone said, look, this is because of globalization. Because someone can go from Chengdu one day to Milan the next, and suddenly all of Italy is down with the COVID virus. So similarly, we are now seeing the globalization knock-on effects on everybody's economy. I'd like to turn then to what has been India's position, and most of you know what India's position is. We've been articulating it. I'm sure you've heard External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar say again and again, we will do what is in India's interest. So what India has essentially done is it has abstained from any international vote that calls on it to condemn Russia's actions. India has not once criticized Russia's actions. India has not condoned them either. It has basically said, let us go towards diplomacy. Peace is the only way out. Ceasefire must be brought in. Human rights violations must end. But India has itself not taken a side. This is no longer a unique position. There are other countries that we are seeing are also taking exactly the same position. As I said, 160 did not join the sanctions. 140 countries nearly actually condemned Russia at the United Nations, but 160 did not join the sanction. So this should tell you where most of the world is lying. Certainly the South, what is called the global South of the world, is over here. What are the specific reasons why India has taken the stand it has? And I'm going to take you quickly through those reasons, because there are actually 10 of them. Everybody focuses on the idea that it is India's traditional relationship with Russia, that there was a Soviet Union, a friendship treaty, the fact that India has not in the past also criticized Russia. That is one of the reasons. Certainly a traditional partnership, a traditional relationship is important. But what we are seeing actually the government take is a decision as much, if you like, calibrated towards the present and the future. So the present is, the first is dependence on Russian military hardware. Despite a decade of diversifying from other arms, and regardless of what people tell you today, India's purchases from Russia still make up about 60% of India's hardware, military hardware. 85% of its spares procurement come from Russia. And nearly all of the technology transfers in these purchases comes from Russia. Other countries don't do technology transfers the way Russia did. India's premier military export, for example, is something called the BrahMos missile. It's a result of India-Russia collaboration. You can't have that kind of collaboration in today's day with any other country. So no matter what people tell you about India's dependence on Russian hardware coming down, the fact is it is actually still very high, and it is an area of concern, because if Russia continues this war in Ukraine, continues to need its military hardware for its own use, it is going to be able to export less. Secondly, as its economy bleeds out, which is what essentially the West is doing, it's going to be more and more difficult for them to produce all of this hardware, and India could get stuck with hardware but no spares or no technology availability. The third reason for India's position has been Russia's support at the United Nations. And I'm sure all of you have read those WhatsApp forwards about the number of times Russia has helped India out. But most importantly, it is because Russia is the single most dependable partner with a veto. It is able to stop something at the United Nations that could hurt India's position. Some of you might say there are Western countries that have supported India, but Western countries come with a baggage attached as well. They require you to work with them on other issues. The fourth is, and this is just a simple thing, Napoleon Bonaparte once was asked about the history of a country. And he said, tell me the geography of your country and I will tell you your history. The reason he said that is if you look at a map, you know straight away how a country has to deal with its challenges. India's map makes it very clear. There are two biggest continental neighbors are China and Pakistan, and both are a challenge, one more than the other right now. And the truth is that while India has a partnership with the US, in the Quad, for example, maritime areas and all these others, it is not going to change the continental challenge. Continental challenge is what? 3,500 kilometers of a line of actual control, where Chinese soldiers are all along the way. We are going to have to man that. The line of control with Pakistan, is there any part of that we can't man while terrorists might be infiltrated? No. Also add to it the terrorist threat possibly from Afghanistan and what is happening there. It means that India's continental challenges are going to mean that India cannot break away from a country like Russia, which actually helps it manage these challenges. Every time there's a problem with China, certainly Russia has been supportive of India, or at least has tried to build some kind of via media between the two countries. And when it comes to Pakistan, it would be a complete disaster for India if it, on its continental spheres, had problems with China, had problems with Pakistan, also had problems with Russia, which means all of Central Asia would be a problem. It would really be a very, very difficult environment for India. Fifth are the economic costs. The same people, and I'm sure you've heard this before, on Europe still continuing to buy oil. So that's one part of the double standard. The other is that when in 2018, the US put pressure on India and said, stop all your oil from Iran. And let's remember, Iran used to give India more than 12% of its crude oil. And it was the best crude oil. It was the sweetest crude oil India had access to. And because Iran was dealing with other sanctions, they were able to give us their best oil at very, very cheap prices. So Iran was this great supplier of oil for India, and India decided to zero out, decided to give it up because Mr. Trump sounded like he could do anything at that time. And India suffered. We gave up Iranian oil and we gave up Venezuelan oil at that time. And the truth is that if we were to do this again, succumb again to this kind of pressure to the United States, it is something that India would have to deal with the cost of, which is quite high. So this time instead, we heard the government saying, sorry, this time we are going to take the discounted oil. The sixth area is on renewable energy. This is again something people don't look at, but if you look at our renewable energy, and if you look at the nuclear power sector, for example, India has many nuclear power plants. But the only ones that have foreign collaboration that are actually working right now are the Russian ones, Kudankulam. and new ones being planned in that series. Even though we have civil nuclear contracts with the US, with Japan, with France, with other people who produce these nuclear power plants, the fact is none of them have actually gone through yet. Of course, legal hassles being one of the big reasons. Then if you look at number 7, that is that in the broader scheme, and this is something I said to you earlier, if 40 countries are with the US and Europe when it comes to sanctions, and 160 approximately are not, this means from Mexico, South America, Africa, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, UAE, South Asia, Southeast Asia, all of these countries are not joining the sanctions. What it could mean in the extreme is that the US becomes very tough and says anyone who's dealing with us cannot deal with Russia. What will that lead to? It'll lead to what is called the de-dollarization of the global economy, or certainly at least a division into a dollar and a non-dollar world. Already, if you pick up the papers, you will be reading about various groups of countries getting together and talking about trading in local currencies. What that means is essentially we will be looking at a division in the world. And therefore, India needs to keep its options open, be with this side as well as with this side. Why would they give up one over the other? There is also the sense of comfort levels. We see India as part of BRICS with Russia, RIC with Russia, today the SCO, where External Affairs Minister Jaishankar is there meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister. So there's a kind of a comfort level. And as I said, Russia has often played a part in making things a little easier for India on the strategic front. And finally, number 10 is something that we thought had gone away, which is the principle of non-alignment. About 5 years ago, every time I mentioned non-alignment, people would giggle or laugh because this was not important to India anymore. Prime Minister Modi completely gave up going to any non-aligned summit, said that the government made it very clear they didn't see a point. But now we're seeing non-alignment coming back. The Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, has in an article in the Times of India written that non-alignment has served India well in the Russian crisis. It is also a way for the government to assert its independence and its right to be sovereign. That whether it is the UN votes, whether it is buying Russian oil, India will do what is in India's best interest. And this is something that has been popular. Foreign policy is not always tested out on the streets, but I think this is a part of foreign policy that has been popular. I have not really heard people in India complaining about this. So I come to the last part of what I wanted to speak about, which is how has Russia-Ukraine changed our future? And this is important to see because we might think, okay, this is one more conflict in the world. There's so many conflicts going on. There's China, Taiwan about to blow up. We've got issues between so many neighboring countries, Azerbaijan and Armenia, India and Pakistan, others like that. But the truth is the Russia-Ukraine war has changed our future because this is now the biggest post-World War II challenge to the global world order. If there was an international order that we spoke about after the creation of the United Nations and after the last World War, many of the things we took for granted since 1945 have now gone away. The future of conflict has changed. Russia's unilateral bombardment of Ukraine, many have compared it, of course, to what the US did in Iran, in Iraq, and other such things, or what Russia did earlier in Georgia. But this has been qualitatively different. And I think it has come without any kind of sense that there was a reason for the bombardment. In other words, there was an immediate provocation, an immediate military action that caused this. So the future of conflict is going to change. People are going to do what they think they can get away with. So China is taking the wrong messages. You're seeing all the assertion on Taiwan. Afghanistan, the Taliban took over before the Russia war, but it is clear for them that they are now quite immune to any international pressure on changing the way that they are running their government in Afghanistan. In Myanmar too, after the coup, we can see that the generals are not seeing any pressure internationally to work according to certain norms or international norms. So they're learning the wrong lessons. The second future that's changed is our universal values. We're no longer talking about that universal human rights declaration, whether it's Russia, whether it's the US, whether it's even India. Every country is now saying, I will define universal values according to what are my values. There are no more universal values because after what Russia has done in Ukraine, how are you going to compare? The future of trade, as we have discussed, is already changing. The future of currency, also what we discussed, is changing. And finally, what we're seeing is that the future of global cooperation is changing. The journalist and analyst called Ian Bremmer runs something called G0 Media. What does G0 mean? He said in 2011, he said that there are all these various groupings that we are seeing around the world, right? There's a G20, there's a G7 that became a G8, it went back to being a G7. We constantly hear G19 plus, G20 plus, G8 plus 5, D10, which is democracies. So he said eventually these are all going to go away and they will be replaced simply by G0, which means each country will be basically there for themselves. They might meet on various multilateral fora, but they will take decisions on their own. Unfortunately, he is looking closer to his prediction coming true than many had thought at the time. And I think that's where I will pause, because I think we do need to look at solutions. We need to reframe our world. We perhaps need to think about a new United Nations, reforming the UN. India needs to look and say, can we be G0? Or if we need to work with other countries, should we actually be looking closer in our region? In other words, can India work without the subcontinent, without South Asia, its immediate land boundary neighbors, in order to ensure that our economy is not affected in the way we have seen all economies being affected in just 6 months of this conflict? So I'm going to stop right here because I hope that you have questions for me, and we'll come back to some of these issues.
Great, ma'am. Thank you very much. This is a very, very extensive talk. In fact, it covers much, much more than what we have expected. And I believe that this 1 hour is just not sufficient. However, we will restrict it to 1 hour and we will focus on the questions that we have. But your talk has laid out completely in terms of the anatomy of the war in some sense, its immediate impacts on a variety of fronts like economy, inflation, and the reflected inflation in various other countries which are dependent on Russia and also Ukraine. And in terms of the most beautiful thing that you've captured is how it is affecting our future. Our future of conflict is changing, and the way our values and value systems of the various countries are affected now, and nobody is talking about human rights. And therefore, it is very easy to understand other things like trade being affected, other things like currency being affected is just in the offing. And the way G20 would probably go to Z0, which is the future of cooperation. I think it has laid out a profound and significant way of understanding what's actually happening. This is the stuff that general entertainment channels will not be able to provide. This is like reading a very simple article made easy further by your narration. And I'm very, very thankful to you, ma'am, for making it simpler and easier for us to understand. And with this, I'll now call in Professor Prasad to initiate the Q&A. We have about a couple of clusters. The first module will be taken by Professor Prasad, and I'll come back for the second one. Okay, over to you, Professor Prasad. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rao. I hope it's audible.
It is.
Thank you, ma'am, for a well carved out summary as well as insights into what has been happening over the last 6 months and one of the most important events perhaps in our lifetimes. And in this context, the first question is slightly different. I'd like to step back, and then this is a personal question which is meant to motivate our audience in terms of careers, etc. You've taken a certain background, and today you have a role where you speak to heads of states. You're able to understand upfront, right, across the table, how people think and what is it that influences many of these matters. Now, how did you carve out your career, or take this particular direction, get the inspirations? What are the basic principles of your work and life which have helped you to get here?
Thank you. People don't often ask journalists to speak about themselves. We tend to have such a frenetic pace in our lives that we don't spend too much time reflecting on how we got where we did. The truth is journalism continues to be a journey. It is not, you will not find people who are in the field any different from the day they started. I've done 28 years now in the profession. And I can honestly say I start my day very much as I used to when I was a 21-year-old. And it was very much, in terms of being interested in the news, reading at least 10 newspapers a day, watching every television channel that I could. In those days, there weren't so many, thank God. But my career has been really three very specific silos, if you like, which one has led to the other. Most people you meet might tell you that they move from print to television. Mine was exactly the opposite. I actually studied television journalism, broadcast journalism, radio, and all the rest in the United States, and worked for CNN International there at the United Nations. Subsequently, I moved to India, and we covered all of South Asia from the Delhi bureau in those days. So I was with CNN International for about 10 years. And it was my job, in a sense. I was a producer and then a reporter. It was my job more or less to interpret this region for the world on the global stage. After that, I joined CNN IBN, which is still a television channel affiliated to CNN. And I became the foreign editor there. So now my job role reversed completely. Instead of interpreting my region for the world, I was interpreting the world's developments for my region, or certainly for my country at least, which is a different kind of a thing. And that's why in the first half of the first part of my career, I did much more in terms of conflict in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, even Nepal, Bangladesh, and all the rest. But in the second part, I was covering places like Libya, Syria, Lebanon, and other conflict zones a little further out as well. And then I moved to the Hindu, which is, of course, one of India's most widely read English national dailies. Everyone who's done a competitive exam has come across it at some point or the other, and we get a lot of very good feedback from our readers. And I've worked for the Hindu for the last 8 years. As the diplomatic editor, basically doing a lot of what I've been doing all my life, except I'm doing it in the print format. If you ask me what my inspirations have been, honestly, journalists cannot think of a particularly good reason to be a journalist. I say this because if you were to look, and I feel ashamed in front of an audience like this one to talk about things like salaries, because journalists really are the lowest paid amongst professionals. There isn't a really good reason. I often tell journalism students, don't join for the money. You will never know what your work timings are because they start at 6 a.m. and end at midnight, and sometimes don't even stop there. I've done 24-hour shifts quite a few times. Don't think about the idea of the glamour. Many people talk about, the glamour of being on television or having a byline read. The truth is that that's a very small part of the kind of work you have to put in order to get there. And certainly don't join it because you think you will over time be able to, have a more easy existence. It actually gets more difficult. You'll find out very quickly who your friends are and how much your family really loves you, according to how many dinners and lunches you cancel with them. And certainly I must thank ICFAI, as I said, for their patience with me as well. But what does motivate us is very much the idea that what we do changes something. It doesn't have to be a big change in the world. But if our job is to interpret and to make people aware of what is happening in the world, I would not use the word educate, because education comes from a very different place. It's a much more, it's a very different kind of field. But I think a journalist's duty really is, it's a public duty to ensure that people are aware of what is happening in their times and to break it down for them. Nobody, everybody is able to go to the internet and pick up a piece of news and interpret it for themselves in a sense. But everybody also has other jobs to do. So as a result, it is our job as a journalist to try and understand the issues and then to interpret them and maybe break them down for our readers and viewers. And if we're able to do that, and if we're able to effect change for the better, whether it is a consumer, whether it is someone who has been treated badly, someone who has been exploited, someone who's been discriminated against, or whether in fact it is a larger question of society, if we can make that little change, I think that's what is the most inspirational.
Thank you, ma'am. I think the essence is about one's ability to impact what's happening in society through the method of interpretation and communication. Thank you, ma'am. The next question is about, the conflict has affected the whole world globally. What are the prime concerns at hand, and do you think it could have been avoided?
See, that's a very interesting question, because up till February 24th, we in India certainly were aware that it was building, but it was an avoidable crisis. After all, we know what has essentially been Russia's unhappiness with NATO. And if you look at the map of Europe, just put it in front of you and you look at 3 different dates, you see what was there in 1991, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and where NATO was at that time. And you add to it the kind of, the additions to NATO that took place in 1998, then in 2003, which was the big one, and then in 2008. So in 1998 and then 2003, you saw, I think, about double the number of NATO countries. So from about 20, they went to about 40 at that time, but I could be wrong on the numbers, joining NATO, which came closer and closer to Russia. Now, Russia's understanding in 1991 had been, and the world almost signed, they signed an agreement, especially on Ukraine, because remember, Ukraine had many of the nuclear missiles of Russia, of Soviet Union, that were kept over there. As a result, just give me 1 second. I see that I haven't put my plug point on. The battery could have died. So essentially, Russia thought that it had security guarantees from the world when it allowed, when it went into that agreement, moving Ukraine's nuclear armaments out. It also saw that the US gave certain assurances, Europe gave certain assurances that they would not aggress Russia's borders. That obviously went away over time. As the world became more confident about a post-Soviet Union world, you almost saw them disregard these security guarantees. By the time in 2008 that NATO met, they actually said that they were putting Ukraine and Georgia onto what they called a wait list for NATO. Now, this would have obviously set off certain alarm bells in Russia, with the idea that NATO was going to come right up to Russian borders. So we saw in 2008, a year later actually, from 2007 to 2008, we saw Russia invade parts, 2 areas, South Ossetia, in Georgia, and do pretty much what we saw them do with Crimea in 2014. And each time Russia made the same case, that if you are going to take away our border security by including these countries into NATO, then we are going to react to that. So the Crimea invasion was seen very much in the same lines, although there is a historical basis Russia has claimed and Mr. Putin has claimed to what they did. So what happened over here was, over a period of a year, we heard from Russia saying again and again that if Ukraine was going to join NATO, then Russia would take that very seriously, as practically as an invasion on its own boundaries. NATO, of course, said nothing. Ukraine wouldn't rule it out. You see, Mr. Zelensky, while he has really shown immense courage right now through this war, at the time he thought he could still sort of play with a little bit of ambiguity, and said that, we haven't really made a decision on it. This caused Russia to make its plans, and whether those plans have gone off the rails today, 6 months later or not, we will only know in posterity. But it made its plans to annex 2 parts of Ukraine, 2 extra parts of Ukraine. After all, they've already taken Crimea, and went about doing that first by bombarding Western Ukraine, diverting the Ukrainian army that side, and then just moving the Russian forces into the easternmost part of Ukraine, the 2 republics that you now hear of, which are Donetsk and Luhansk. All of this we can understand, but I will still say that on February 24th, what Mr. Putin decided to do, what Russia chose to do, was to bombard civilians. And that has changed the complexion of how this war will always be seen. Until February 24th, there was an understanding, even if the international community didn't take it seriously enough, there was an understanding of what Russia was doing. After February 24th, I think it is quite clear that Russia has violated its own commitments on unilateral aggression, on territorial sovereignty, and all the rest of that. So when you say, was it avoidable? I think it was avoidable if the international community had realized the seriousness of Russia's intentions. And even though the US was actually saying it since December, nobody actually thought it would happen. And I can tell you, I think many Russians didn't think it would happen either. Once it has happened, it is unfortunate that despite everything, the international community has not been able to either stop Russia or to stop the war. In fact, if you ask me, the steps taken by the West in polarizing the situation further, I have shown that they have not actually been successful either.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we do have some idea about the concerns that various parties did have, particularly Russia, and what kind of actions they have taken in that particular time. The next question, ma'am, is about what are the possible scenarios ahead in your view, and what could be India's choices and future challenges in that context?
Well, I think all the future, sort of crystal ball gazing that we had seen so far has not worked. There were those who told us on February 24th that this war will be over in 10 days. Putin is going to take Donetsk and Luhansk. The world will move on as it moved on in Crimea in 2014 and moved on in Georgia in 2008. In fact, that did not happen. The world did not move on. The US and Europe moved in a very, very strong manner. In fact, they've been criticized because people have said you didn't react this way when other refugees were created. You only seem to react when refugees who actually look much more like Europeans started to pour out. That's when you reacted. But the fact is that they reacted in an unprecedented manner. So the kind of sanctions we have seen are completely unprecedented. Cutting off Russia from SWIFT, cutting off Russia's oil purchases, cutting off Russia's currency, freezing Russia's assets abroad, going after oligarchs in the way that they have gone after, freezing their assets abroad, cutting off flight connections between the countries, cutting off any kind of cultural activities between the two areas. So what they have done is also unprecedented. So we are seeing that neither side has actually done what they had been expected to do, in a sense. And the third part, that the impact of all these sanctions has not deterred Russia yet. So first idea was war will be over in 10 days. It wasn't over in 10 days. Second idea was within 3 months or whatever, even less, we will bring Russia to its knees economically. It's already a troubled economy. It's not going to survive. That also has not happened. So now we have to look at what is the long-term scenario here. I think what we are seeing, unfortunately, looks like a stalemate. The stalemate is going to mean that Russia remains in control of these areas of eastern Ukraine, that the invasion is not going to be rolled back easily, and that Ukraine is also going to survive, because there was this concern that Ukraine itself would either get divided into Russia and Poland, and that would be the end of that. So the Ukrainians have shown through their resistance and through their ability to stay united in the face of this kind of a massive challenge, that they're also going nowhere. So in the long term, I fear that we're looking at a kind of uneasy status quo, which could break out into conflict at any time. I also think that the long-term effects of the sanctions are going to be felt, and even Europe and the US are going to have to rethink the extent. In fact, you're already seeing, like on the food ban, for example, they had banned Russian food exports. Now they've allowed it because they're seeing the price of wheat going through the roof. The same will probably happen. Everyone is predicting in December, when it gets to freezing temperatures in Europe, and Europe suddenly realizes that they do need natural gas from Russia, that they do need more oil from Russia, and perhaps let up on other sanctions as well. But the worst scenario is going to be the one that we've already seen play out with Iran, where neither do the sanctions go away, nor does the misery of the common person go away, and the hostilities continue.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that's, a lot more uncertainty ahead in terms of what seems to be there. And I hope wisdom prevails. The next question, ma'am, is under such a situation, all countries have evolved some policies or the other with respect to how to deal with it. Now, what are the basic principles at play? You did touch on one or two when you have spoken, but if you have to look at it as a put a full perspective on it, what are the basic principles at play currently, which are going to last for some time?
I'll answer that from the Indian perspective, because we've seen how the government has had to think about each. The immediate impact of the war was felt in India on the basis of those students, the medical students stuck inside Ukraine. So the first real priority for the government was to bring out all Indians safely. I think one passed away, unfortunately, got hit in the crossfire, but they were able to bring out close to 20,000 Indians eventually. At some cost from Ukraine. They certainly delayed it because people didn't think that it was going to happen so quickly. And the government moved, Mr. Modi spoke to Mr. Zelensky on the phone. He speaks to Mr. Putin quite regularly. And he sort of built this this bridge so that they were able to bring the Indians out. So the first priority is going to be to ensure that Indians are not in harm's way. But if you're looking at the future, is there a country in the world where there aren't Indians? And I'm talking about Indian citizens, not Indian origin people. Most of the world has Indian citizens in some form or the other. It's going to be very difficult to say we have to stay out of conflict areas. So that's one. The second priority is going to be the question of, if you like, bulletproofing or war-proofing the economy. This is something every country is now thinking about how to do. What it means is becoming more and more self-reliant, and Atmanirbhar is a word that has been used, but it is definitely going to mean that supply chains have to be much more streamlined and protected. It might mean in the long term that we have to learn to do with less. Because after all, when India came out of its economic solitude in 1991, previous governments were criticized because they said India has been shut off from the world economy for too long. We should have allowed globalization much earlier. Suddenly Indians had not one or two, but 10 brands of toothpaste to deal with. We embraced the world, as it were, or the globalized economy, as it were. But the future might not be as easy, whether it is a question of your currency reserves, whether it is a question of becoming independent or less dependent on the rest of the world for manufacturing goods, then we are going to look at a more insular, if you like, but inward-looking future. I think that's something the government is grappling with, because it will not be popular, and no government is popular for saying, sorry, you can no longer buy imported goods, or sorry, we can't get chips from outside, for example, for cars, so there's going to be a long waiting period. And this is going to be the second big challenge, I think, dealing with globalization. The third big challenge, I think, is going to be dealing with conflict at our boundaries. And by that, I don't just mean like the kind of India-Pakistan thing that is kind of a Cold War for so long and, terror attacks, that kind of thing. I mean, the idea that every country in our neighborhood could get into trouble economically, and we are going to have to help them, but fireproof ourselves, as we have seen in the Sri Lanka situation. Because what will happen if the Sri Lanka situation gets more out of control? We will see an outpouring of refugees. We will have to build our systems and change our rules and laws in order to bring that in some way. This is a government that has made it very clear. They're very tough on the subject of immigration, on the subject of refugees. They don't want to take more. But now what are they going to do when this conflict is now at our boundary? So I think the third is going to be the physical, as I said, the geography of future conflict that is happening. And I think the fourth area where we are really going to have to do some soul searching is the idea that India, honestly, India has a position at the top. That every Indian will tell you that, India deserves a seat at the high table of the world. We're a global leader. Now, you're looking at a situation where globalization is not what it's cracked up to be. Today, if you look at the United States, if you look at Russia, if you look at China, none of them is giving you a model that can tell you this is how a global leader should be. Even if you look at something non-conflict, something like COVID, which of these countries can you say is a model of how the COVID pandemic should have been dealt with. India, of course, was no model. But the truth is the global leaders were no model. Those global leaders have gone away. So globalization is no longer what it's cracked up to be simply because our global models have gone away. Being completely independent is, we know in this world, although I've drawn out this map for you, is not a possibility anymore. Indians are too used to traveling the world, are too used to gaining from the rest of the world, have a constant flow of trade and ideas going back and forth. So is there a via media and country and world around, people are learning that via media is their immediate region. So we are the only region, if you like, South Asia is the only region which does not have a proper trade agreement or even trade between most of our neighbors, between India and Pakistan, there's zero contact at present. In comparison, you will see the US, a big country like the US is part of the US NAFTA with Canada and Mexico. The South American countries are part of Mercosur, which is very, very useful for them in terms of free trade of goods. The European Union, I don't need to say much more. Most of their trade happens within the European Union. ASEAN works within itself. They give each other a lot of trade tariff waivers. We're seeing countries basically grouping themselves, RCEP, a new one, which includes Japan, Australia, China, South Korea as well, which India walked out of, is one more grouping like this, which by the time it finishes, I think within 20 years, it's going to do away with 90% of the tariffs between all these countries. What are we left with here? There's also Eurasia, the EAEU, the Eurasian Economic Union. The Gulf countries work on their own. African Union works on its own. They all have some kind of trade sort of concessions for each other that binds them together, that helps them work together, that helps their supply chains. Why don't we have that in South Asia? And I really think that while, again, like non-alignment, when everybody used to giggle, SARC is something I say, and people just say, what world are you in? You're really out of touch with the times and reality. The fact is the only reality for us can be within South Asia. Unless South Asia is a force multiplier for India, then all those dreams about being on the global high table, I'm afraid, are going to be very difficult to achieve.
Thank you, ma'am. I think you've covered vast terrain, and there are some, at least about 7 or 8 areas in which you've spoken, and each of them have implications. For instance, I think you're indicating that there is going to be something on GDP and consumption that will take a hit, and it's not very palatable politically. Things seem to be the old ways, and it doesn't work out so easily. I think you also mentioned about the inward looking and the political implications of that. You mentioned about the need to work with the neighboring countries, and you again touched upon it in the last point. That as far as the rest of the world is concerned, there is some sort of a community nearby, and one needs to start looking at neighbors again with fresh eyes, and then see how one can help them in trouble, as well as see how one can use that for trade and things like that. And I think a lot of this is going to have implications in the way we need to think, not only as a nation, but also as organizations, and perhaps even as individuals, maybe from a political viewpoints. Thanks a lot, ma'am. I think I have more questions, but since we are running out of time, in this cluster, I'll hand it back to Professor Rao.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I seem to be getting some grip on what's going on. And at the same time, there is the list of challenges that is coming from you is also painting it gloomy. And again, the next moment, I think, yes, it is gloomy. So there's a recommendatory action to be taken by the concerned nations, and it has a direct or indirect influence on our institutions and organizations and individuals and families at a micro level. I think the whole conversation is moving from the joy of understanding what's happening on one hand, which is at a sublime level, but the more tangible thing when we come to grapple with it is actually gloomy. So that's been happening so far. I'll try and take a couple of questions from the audience, ma'am. One of them I'll just take from the list that we have already. You have actually addressed most of the questions, so therefore I'm skipping those obvious ones. But what will be the financial aids and steps taken by India to counter the damage which has taken place because of the conflict? I think this is a question which is more relevant in the cluster that we have. What will be the financial aids or steps taken by India to counter the damage which has taken place because of conflict?
Right. So if I'm just going to keep it to the conflict's impact, one of the impacts, for example, is on the price of oil. And we've already seen how the government has dealt with it. Unfortunately, it's a little bit ad hoc because what we have seen is that since the government decided to use, to keep the tax buffer as a constant, even when oil prices went up and down, and therefore use the oil pool, sort of not deficits, but the profits for other activity. The incentive has gone away from the government for bringing down your oil prices. And that's why even though oil prices have actually come down quite a lot, we're still not seeing the impact of that. Hopefully that money that is gained will be used prudently, but we are seeing that the government is looking at future oil price, fluctuations in a more strategic way, if you like. There is a question of how much we should, in fact, be looking at storage of oil. And the UAE and Saudi Arabia are now talking about keeping strategic oil reserves in India as a result of that. One of the other areas that we have seen is, as I said, food prices. And again, the decision the government has taken is probably in India's best interest, but it is again an ad hoc one. One day you had the Prime Minister saying, we will feed the world if we are allowed to. The next day comes the ruling that we are banning all wheat exports. The third day comes yet another ruling to say, no, what we'll do is on a government-to-government basis, where people are needy, we will send wheat. So I do think that the government is going to have to look at these strategically. Nobody's blaming anybody, because the fact is that any government has to deal with the dynamics of a situation and come up with new theories. But the important thing I think the government is learning is don't promise what you can't deliver. We learned the lesson the hard way when it came to COVID and it came to vaccines. Without preparation for how many vaccines would be needed inside India, we announced a very grand strategy of giving vaccines to the world. When the Delta virus hit us, it became very clear that we didn't have enough people vaccinated and we didn't have enough vaccines because we'd given away so many. And the government had to quickly rejig that. So I think we are learning from all of these how we have to deal with the idea of a world perennially in crisis. Because it's not one crisis or a second. What does COVID have to do with the Russia-Ukraine war? Nothing. And yet both of them have come together, as I said, in this perfect storm. So that's the second lesson, the third lesson that the government, I think, is having to learn and steps it is learning to take. The fourth one is, I do think, is going to be a difficult one, because it is going to require the government to relook at its currency reserves. Again, and I'm speaking about this particular government because this is the government we know the policies of. It's a very specific kind of policy they've taken. When they came to power, their whole big thing was that the rupee is grossly undervalued, that we will bring the rupee back from 60 rupees to the dollar down to 40. Today, we are looking closer to 80, and it may go further up because in the last 6 months, we've lost about $70 billion of our currency reserves. The fear is that this is because the government has been trying to shore up the rupee. If it is trying to shore up the rupee by using these currency reserves, frankly, that is something very similar to what the Sri Lankan government tried to do as well and failed. Because there's no way you can't hedge against these kind of bets without somebody in the world figuring out what you're doing and then make money off you. And so therefore, we are seeing a troubling situation with the currency. Not at present. I mean, we're looking at $580 billion of currency reserves. That's far more than India has ever had. And yet the fact that every time we try to shore up the rupee and keep its value higher, it actually is unsuccessful. That, I think, is a big worry, and it might lead to certain reactions from the government when it comes to curtailing the amount of currency utilization or the freedom with which we right now are able to exchange currency. So that's another thing I think you should watch out for. I do think on the positive side, 2 budgets have shown us that governments are not very keen to increase income tax. They may find other ways of taxing you, but they have seen that the burden on the common man is extremely high, and even higher taxes, although we are doing it now through other things like GST going up and all, but a higher personal taxes, I think, are going to be very difficult for a government to do and get away with popularly. And finally, I think we do have to keep an eye on the clock, because we are now 2 years away from general elections. And any kind of an unsuccessful attempt to curb the Indian economy is going to have its repercussions. At the end of 2024, this government will have been in power for 10 years. That's a sizable chunk after which you can say, here is what you got right, here's what you didn't get right. And they are aware of that. If you hear Prime Minister Modi saying 2 or 3 times in the last month, and then External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said it as well, we have to stop this culture of freebies. The fact is that the governments are realizing that this freebies no longer is a viable option for a government to deal with the crises, and because there are more crises that will come. What we saw during COVID was only a small part of it. I mean, these were just laborers whom they were not able to organize the transport back home for, and they ended up having to open an extremely large, system of benefit transfers for people around the country. Now, at some point, the bill will be handed to you. So I think we have to keep an eye on the political clock and see that the government will be more and more straightened when it comes to dealing with, and by that I mean STARAITENED, straightened, not straightened out, on how to deal with this. Also, remember, next year India is going to be the host of the G20. The G20 is a grouping that really looks at economic governance, so they will be trying very hard to show themselves as a good example to the world.
Amazing. I think there are lots of lessons and implications in the way some of us manage our organizations and find it extremely difficult. Imagine the situation of a similar situation like this for the countries to handle, especially when the elections are around the corner. Those political compulsions will definitely make you look very good, not only on the domestic front, but also on the international front. But I think though, apart from the fact that we understand that accountability is just around the corner for a government that is in seat for about a decade, but from a leadership point of view, it's a very tough case. It's not easy. It's very, very tough in terms of the lessons. For example, as you connected very well, lessons from COVID versus lessons from war. Of course, in one way, both are war kind of situations, but not only in India, anywhere else in the world also, we did not have role models or lessons to be learned so clearly. Everyone was trying to grapple with the situation in an emerging manner. And there was nothing right, and there was probably everything was wrong. So it's a tough case even now. So the implications and the challenges that you mentioned are very impressive, ma'am. We will take the next question now. That is Benedict. Would you like to ask the question yourself? I'll open the mic for you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it's good to see a journalist in a B-School conference, and also good for a journalist to ask another journalist a question. Okay, so Suhasini, it was quite interesting. So what I think we didn't touch upon is what Rahul Gandhi spoke about in his recently in UK in a conference, which is that what China is doing to India in Ladakh is what exactly Russia is doing to Ukraine. And now that China and Russia are cozying up so closely, so where do you see this leading to?
I think there are many repercussions of what China and Russia, of them coming closer together. To start with your question on what China is doing to us at the LAC, the difference is that we don't yet have an official response on it. So we don't actually have, anyone in the government saying that China has occupied Indian territory. In fact, most people are saying officially that where China is Chinese territory. Prime Minister Modi himself said that nobody has come inside and nobody is inside Indian territory. Now, this might be tactical. This might be in order to ensure that you can have some kind of a, demobilization, disengagement of troops. But what it is doing is it is emboldening China further. Because if after 2 years, you conclude your negotiations without Chinese troops leaving every part of the line of actual control that they have come into since April 2020, they might come back at a different time. So we do have to deal with this reality. I don't think it's a good idea to, beyond that, I don't think it's a good idea to compare because, these are 4 very, very different countries. India is not Ukraine. We are not defenseless. We are able to take care of our defenses to a certain extent. For China too, taking on India beyond a point will be very difficult because China does not have that many friends on the international sphere. But what you pointed out to, the China-Russia combine, this is something that I think our foreign policy establishment is worried about for some time. Their whole point with the US for the last few years has been what? That don't push Russia against the wall because all that will happen is Russia will become more and more indebted to China. And we see China as the bigger worry in the long term of things, given China's capacity. As a result, if you notice the standoff between India and the US over the CATSA purchase was only about this because India said we need to keep Russia on side. We can't keep cutting Russia out and then expect that they will not get closer to China and more dependent on China, more importantly, because of the sanctions. However, we now are in a situation where the US is actually willing to deal with China, but not willing to deal with Russia. Look at the difference between how the US has treated China's threats to Taiwan and how it treated Russia's threats to Ukraine. So what we're seeing very much is that the world is dealing with their challenges as they would like. There is no unified version of what is that challenge. So India has got to think about that as well, that if Russia and China come together and India has taken a position, with other countries, then those countries are not necessarily coming to India's aid in quite the way that we would want. I think the second part is that we must remember that despite all of this, India is still a part of RIC, Russia, India, China, trilateral. India is still a part of BRICS. The Prime Minister was part of an online summit just a month ago with President Xi Jinping, with President Putin. And it's part of SCO, and next month in Samarkand, PM Modi is supposed to go to Uzbekistan. President Xi is certainly expected to come. He may or may not come depending on the COVID situation and also the party congress that is coming up. So India is also staying in this boat. It's keeping its feet in 2 boats. The third part, I will say, and it may be a little controversial to say it over here, but I'll just say this as a journalist. The truth is the way that we are seeing the situation inside India when it comes to authoritarianism, when it comes to what the government feels that it has to do in order to keep its control of the country, whether it is crackdowns on the media, on NGOs, minorities, we are seeing a greater securitization of the entire process. That is something that eventually will bring India in a kind of confrontation with the West, because the West loves to talk about all these issues. Even in December, Prime Minister Modi will go to the US for what? A democracy summit, which Mr. Biden will hold. Compared to that, the Russians and the Chinese never complain about these issues. So if India sees itself in a more authoritarian position, it might find a greater comfort zone with these two. What I'm trying to say is that eventually we don't know how all the chips are going to fall at the end of this. If 2 years ago you could have said very, very clearly, India is moving in the Western direction, and we are going to see India opening up in a very different way in the economy, defense-wise, diversifying from its Russian traditional military hardware. If you could say all of that with some certainty 2 years ago, today you certainly can't say that, because India's choices have changed. The world has suddenly become, or at least the Western world has become suddenly obsessed with its European war to the point that they are not necessarily seeing what's happening here. And the East is moving in a very different way. I've just come back from Indonesia, and let me tell you, the ASEAN countries are not looking at the United States in the way they might have been looking 20 years ago. So you're seeing the world change so much, and I'm not sure if I even answered your question, Benedict. I think that there are many reasons for India to be concerned about the China-Russia coming together. But I think now we've got to deal with what has already happened. There's no question that China and Russia Russia will be more dependent on China, particularly after this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Benedict, for raising that.
Thanks, Sudhakar, for giving me the opportunity.
Ma'am, that was a very comprehensive response. In fact, it has brought out more challenges than one has asked for. But that's the truth. Truth internally and truth externally. There's no unified way of dealing with these challenges. There's no code of a particular thing. There's no cases can be written now. Every single case is very different, and it has to be dealt with and thrown away. And again, come up with a new challenge and a new way of dealing with that.
Very well put.
Yes. So I will, there's one interesting question that we have from the participant, and that is, why is the Russian ruble becoming stronger day by day? So this is the question.
So this would be a question for someone other than a diplomatic journalist to understand. But from what I understand, Russia has not been hit in the way that it felt it was going to be, that the world felt it was going to be hit. It has not been isolated. What has become very clear is Russia still has a lot to give the world, whether it has been in food, in wheat grains, whether it has been in fertilizer, whether it has been in defense hardware. You know, some of those defense production still coming India's way, still going to other countries. And what is also happening is that Russia has found a way, therefore, to ensure that people are willing to work with Russia in local currency. This was something I think the US and Europe did not expect. They had made it so clear that they didn't expect any of their friendly countries will not deal with Russia, that they had not seen that there's this entire world out there. Look at how India is dealing, for example, on Russian oil. This is not about the oil prices. Here, India saw an opportunity. They were getting Russian oil at a huge discount. As I said, the payments are coming through all kinds of ways, but some of it will be in the rupee-ruble payment mechanism. We know that the Russian central bank has been in Mumbai dealing with the Reserve Bank officials to build this payment mechanism. And India is not only buying more oil, we are buying actually 25% of Indian oil purchases by the end of this year could be from Russia. That is compared to, remember, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar saying in February, India takes only 2 to 3% of its oil from Russia. So it has already changed that much. Second is 50% of that oil is going into 2 refineries. One of those is a Russian-owned refinery called Rosneft in Vadinar. And please forgive me for getting into a lot of details, but since your question is just sparking a lot of other thoughts. The second is, of course, Reliance Energy. Reliance Energy's big products are all refinery products. So India is now actually not only a consumer of Russian oil, we are now part of this entire process. We are also benefiting from it along the way. There are other countries that are doing the same. In fact, I read a very interesting thing that India paid for Russian cement with Chinese yuan. So there are other countries moving into this entire alternate economy, if you like. And I think the Russian ruble is the beneficiary of that. I could be wrong. There might be other big reasons that I'm completely missing. I'm certainly not an economics expert, but I can see that the calculations by which they had hoped to really bleed Russia's economy and bring its ruble down to dust. That's what Mr. Biden's officials said. That has not so far worked.
Very interesting, ma'am. I think these reasons look very, very credible. I think what the world has expected to happen to Russia, the way they expected it to be hit, has actually not taken place. And therefore, it is still continue to go strong. There was this question as well. Why is Russia, in the sense that in isolation, which are the strongest aspects of Russian economy which will sustain? This was an associated question asked by one of the participants, and it actually answers the food, fertilizer, and defense hardware.
Also coal.
Dependency. And sorry? Also
coal. Russia has so many various natural resources that will keep it in good stead. Remember, India has about $15 billion worth of stakes in Russian oil reserves. So this is from Vladivostok all the way to the west. We have $15 billion worth of stakes. This is something that was said in Parliament a few months ago.
Wonderful. So there are reasons why Russia remains stronger and relevant even now economically, with so many resources that are worth trading across the world. So next, I will request Mr. Arun Kaul to come in with his question. Mr. Kaul, you can directly ask the question and we'll save some time.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, ma'am. I wanted to have your personal view on the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. You know, President Putin and I think his defense minister directly or indirectly have been saying that they may go to, they may cross that limit. See, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, nobody wanted, we were going away from nuclear weapons. But with this war, how far are we from the, that mutually assured destruction, MAD? How far are we, in your opinion? I mean, is it just a bluff, or is it could happen someday?
To start with, this is a very important and a very serious question. I'm sorry about what's happened with my screen. I think it's because the internet one of the internets that I was working off has changed. I'll try and fix it in the next one. But essentially, what we have seen, as I said, is that the rules-based order is going away. If the world was worried about what Iran did, think of the extent of what Russia could do in the future if it becomes, irresponsible in a nuclear sense. Already we have seen the fears when it came to those specific nuclear power plants in Ukraine, which the Russian troops took over. There was a worry about leaks. There was a worry about maintenance. If they weren't maintained and the Russians didn't allow Ukrainian workers to come in and maintain them, then what could happen over there? The IAEA put out a bunch of resolutions telling Russia that it could not afford to, play around in this kind of a manner, but it didn't change. What happens to the idea of mutually assured destruction? Well, I do think, in a sense, when you have two neighbors fighting each other, that if anything, it is clear that that the war will work below the nuclear threshold in that sense. I mean, I hope. Maybe I'm being over optimistic. I'm one of those who believes that mutually assured destruction is a global phenomenon. The moment that first nuclear weapon is used, it will not only have a reaction, however tactical or whatever you might want to call it, it'll have a reaction across the world. It'll be a kind of game of dominoes in a sense. So we can just say goodbye after that. But I do hope that one of the lessons we are taking away is that people are still trying to work below that nuclear threshold, that we are not seeing the same kind of dirty bombs being used and other such things in this war as of now. But I'm being over optimistic over here, I'm sure.
Thank you, ma'am.
One more interesting question, and after that, I will ask Professor Prasad to come in for any questions if he has got. Is NATO going to counterattack Russia if Russia invades Sweden?
If Russia invades Sweden, I think they don't have a choice because now Sweden has applied. And I think there will be no question that there will be some kind of a counterattack. I mean, the game of hypotheticals goes on, and I will be honest, as journalists, we are always taking part in these kind of, war gaming and outcome gaming exercises. But I do think that everyone is stretched to such a point right now that you're not really going to see the next aggression take place. We're barely dealing with the current aggression, as it were. And for all that, I do agree that Russia has come through it for the moment and is still standing up. But I don't think that this war is going to end well for Russia in the long term. I think in the long term, Russia has put everything into Ukraine, and at the end of the day, it might only get a little more security protection. It is not going to be able to go back to the days when it was able to, work with the Western world. I don't think anyone is taking back these sanctions. So in the long term, Russia is also going to pay quite a heavy price for being in this situation. So, I genuinely think we need to prepare from all sides that this is a war without winners in many ways. There are no winners. You can even say after the Crimea War, okay, Russia was able to manage what it had taken, but it already was hit by sanctions. This is going to see even fewer ones. So the theory, I know that we can war game a lot of possibilities. What could Mr. Putin do next? Frankly, nobody could guess what Mr. Putin was going to do now even.
Yes. Professor Prasad, would you like to come in? Do you have any question?
Sure. I think there's one question for the benefit of the audience. In the beginning, looking at it as consumers of information, we had a certain level of intensity of the war and the kind of news items which were there, and we were able to understand. But that has decreased in many senses. Sometimes, from a consumer point of view, inflation in the US and Europe, that's begun to take over, and surveys are saying that the opinion on the war in terms of number of percentage of people who are responding to it has come down compared to inflation. In India also, what we are hearing about the war has come down, and the kind of perspectives that you're giving on in today's webinar, I mean, it's quite useful to all of us, but we don't get to hear a lot of it in the media. So given the situation, what are the lessons in communication that, as users of information, what can we derive from this?
I think what is happening in this, what people call post-truth world or whatever, is that it is very clear that there is a necessity to diversify one's input. News inputs have to be diversified. In other words, you can no longer just depend on one particular style of news to come, unless, of course, it's the Hindu, which we think is complete. But what I'm saying very seriously is that every truth now has two sides. If you were to watch Russian channels today, you would not get anywhere close to the story that you're getting if you watch American channels today. And those American channels have decided to give up their idea of being neutral in the conflict as well. You see how the BBC and CNN, which are really respected organizations, and my own former organization, will cover the Ukraine war, is not to give Russia any kind of benefit. They don't discuss, for example, the NATO expansion impact as we discussed over here. So the first thing is to diversify. I think the second is, and I make this as a plea as a journalist as well, to invest in the news. More and more what is happening is people are looking at news as something they should be able to get for free. But news gathering takes money, news production takes money. So if you are not buying newspapers, paying for online subscriptions, watching television where you pay for the cable subscriptions, what you're essentially going to get is substandard news because you're not paying for it, and so therefore I think the second thing is that people must start to invest in the news. And the third is I think you have to hold news outlets accountable for where they get it wrong. If somebody is clearly giving you the wrong news or one-sided news, then you need to show, with your disapproval, with your cancellation of subscription or whatever else, that you don't subscribe to news that is not doing a public service in that sense. So my sense is the Russia-Ukraine war has just brought this more into focus. We are now more and more able to see how polarized the truth has become. That one man's truth is really not the other person's truth. And the need, in India, in a certain sense, because we are abstentionist, neutral, or whatever, you are able to get both sides of the story. But I can tell you, in the outside world, it's extremely polarized.
Thank you, ma'am. I think a number of lessons here. First is that there is no black and white. There are many shades of gray, and one must learn how to understand these shades of gray. You also touched upon the economy of news, that it should not be the way it was, and there needs to be some change in the way we look at it in terms of our willingness to pay. And of course, the third being the accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot. We'll now bring in two questions. One is from Samyadeep Chakravarti, and the one is Patri Ramana. Who will go first? Mr. Ramana, you would like to go first?
See, Russia is a country where we used to, when we were youthful, we used to think of perestroika, those changes, everything. But now, as I look at Putin's ideologies are very different. Is it not a disturbing trend for all of us that we have no place for human values and human rights.
And I think that's a very important point, that if we were to just strip away every other political part of this debate, at the end of the day, and this is something I tried to say earlier, the decision to bomb civilians, innocent civilians, cannot be whitewashed. It cannot be explained as, but what about other people? But what about what they did to them? But what about the history? But what about the grievances and all the rest of that? I think there has to be an acknowledgement that what is wrong is wrong. And to be honest, I had written about this in a newspaper article that got me into some trouble with not only members of our government, but the Russian embassy as well, where I said that India has all these reasons, and I wrote out, I told you 10 reasons why India has decided to do what it has done. I said it is all these very sensible reasons of the head to stay neutral or to be allied to Russia or to not criticize Russia as well. But for the simple thing of what Russia has done, India must condemn it. India must criticize what has, because that is not left to any doubt. We all know what has happened in the Ukraine. We've all seen the bombed buildings. We've all seen the kind of suffering it has created and the number of refugees it has created in a world which already had too many refugees. So I completely agree with you that human values have to stand at the end of the day. Otherwise, we all become very cynical people and say, his war is not my war is not the next guy's war. It's all going to be about might is right and who can, as I said, who can get away with how much.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. But what I am feeling is, what did Putin gain by this also?
This is a question many people are asking, that at the end of the day, what is Putin going to get out of this entire war? The fact is that in 2008 and in 2014, he did gain. He was able to show that he took back areas of Russia and make Russia more secure. And I think that's what he probably thought he was doing over here. Many had thought that he would again do the same thing, which is just annex that part of Ukraine that was closest to Russia. Where he decided against in terms of bombarding civilians on the Ukrainian side, it seemed like a pure act of revenge. The bombing of Odessa, for example, the bombing of these big cities, Kharkiv, where our Indian student died as well. It seemed almost like, there was something personal about what he was doing there. So while one may have understood the idea of the areas abutting Russia, because these are Russian-speaking areas, they in fact called the population pro-Russian at the time, and they held Ukraine responsible for not developing these regions as they should have, or not allowing Russian as a language over there. There are many reasons for this grievance feeling. But what he gained from it, I really think is something posterity will judge. But at the moment, certainly the support of his people is with him. People who go to Russia say he doesn't seem to face that kind of opposition. Of course, we know that opposition is not allowed to come out. We saw the crackdowns on those protests against the war in Ukraine in the first few days as well. So it's hard to say, what may have been the idea at the time and what it is today. I certainly think that no matter what we don't know about Mr. Putin's plan, I don't think his plan was to have a 6-month protracted war that really goes nowhere.
Thank you, ma'am. Samyadip, very quickly,
Yes.
your last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Professor Rao and Professor Prasad, and thanks a lot, Suhasini, ma'am. I mean, it's one of the very, very, close to my heart topic. That's why I just could not stop myself from asking this question. I'm saying that there are two main power blocks which are coming out. One is the Quad, and other side is the BRICS. But they are antagonistic, basically, in their principles and objectives to each other. So can we just throw some light on why this birth of a Quad is a sort of a indication for a weakening BRICS, or what so? Because the Quad's main agenda, to some extent, is against two of the major, participant countries of the BRICS. So what's your thought on that, ma'am?
Thanks so much. And obviously you have thought about these issues quite a lot. So I will only suggest maybe nudging it a little bit and tweaking your question to not Quad versus BRICS, because, BRICS is an economic engagement by and large. What are the BRICS countries working on? They're working on an alternate SWIFT system, the BRICS payment system. They're working on local currency trade mechanisms. They're working on, they already have a BRICS bank that has disbursed quite a lot of money, 75 projects, I think, in various countries. It's called the New Development Bank, NDB. So a lot of their concerns are in BRICS are economic. In that sense, it's more juxtaposed against the G7, if you like, the richest countries, or they used to call themselves the richest countries. And the Quad is actually, if you like, juxtaposed to the SCO. And when you think about it, India joined the SCO in exactly the same year as it revived the Quad. So India must have been thinking something in terms of the strategic balancing between the two. I remember writing a piece to say, where you stand, how you stand depends on where you sit. But where is India sitting? We're sitting in both places at this time. Right. And how are you going to explain this? I do think that there is some kind of a point at which, where you are going to have to choose, or all of these organizations are going to go away. That means I don't think one is going to weaken at the cost of the other. I think all are going to weaken more and more. Oh, I'm back. I do think that whether or not you see it, because, when you read our papers or whether you read a lot of the international media, you'll never see much coverage of SCO or BRICS, and you'll be saying, well, we don't really do much with them. But the actual fact is, when it's been on Afghanistan, we have done much more with SCO countries. We continue to do it than we have with the Quad, for example. With the Quad, the Americans walked out of Afghanistan. They left us high and dry. So that's not, so we are working more with the SCO when it comes to that. When it comes to vaccines, for example, there is an R&D center. So the Quad has a vaccine initiative. The BRICS countries have a vaccine R&D center in South Africa that they've set up. When it comes to climate change, we're working on both. Every issue you look at, maybe except for technology, where on 5G, we're definitely not taking that to BRICS right now and working with the Quad. You will see some kind of balancing, but there'll be things we'll do with them, which we don't have a bank with Quad, but we have one with BRICS. So I would say just broaden your balancing that you're talking about and make it SCO plus BRICS on one side versus Quad and the G7 plus, because India is a part of the countries that are invited to the G7 as an extra.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I mean, it's really, a new way to
comprehensive answer. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thanks, Amirdeep, for raising that question as well. Ma'am, this session has been extremely useful for us from the sense that it has been looking at India from the world outside and looking from India about the world in a proper sense. I think that's been extremely clear now. The kind of detail that you have gone into in explaining why the war has taken place and how it has resulted in polarization of various kinds, not just of countries, not just of groups of countries, but also in terms of organizations, especially multinational organizations. Some signals were very right, but if you look at all the countries that are available in the world, 40 versus 160, 160 being neutral itself is a signal in aligning with Russia or being silent on Russia for the inherent strengths and the strategic danger that can pose in terms of trade, economy, and multilateral relationships across the world. From there, we have tried and understood to see what is India doing and what kind of stance India has been taking. And we have learned that it is just not an easy game. And the rules are being redefined. This dynamic situation makes any government, not just this government, any particular government at the helm, to behave in a manner that they will have to look at the future in the next 24 months, not just a mere pressure from the elections, but also economic performance of the government will have to be really, really good. Otherwise, things can go the way Sri Lanka has gone. The performance has to be managed carefully in terms of the currency reserves, so to say, the first and most important aspect. And if you lose balance there, probably it can be the tipping point or the spiral down point from there onwards. The old principles or the principles that we actually shunned for some time, like non-aligned movement or the SAARC organization itself, needs to be revisited now. That has come very, very clearly from the conversation and from your perspectives as well. The other thing that has come very well, and we discussed in the just before these few questions, is how there is no role model, how there is no rules, how there is no codifications, how there is no unified approaches, and we will have to deal it every single time it challenges us in its own unique way, depending on the strategic balance that we can arrive at that particular time. And these parcels of time are actually not in decades, not in a couple of years as well, but probably it is changing from month to month. By the time the action is taken in some part of the world and we understand its impact in India, it'll be probably too late. So I think the External Affairs Ministry, as well as the government of India, is definitely on its tenterhooks, and it's not an easy game out there. That's what we understood from your conversation. But one thing that we have to tell the audience and everyone is that India needs to criticize what is called the aggression on territorial sovereignty of a particular country, and massacring the common man is something which has to be condemned. That's what India is supposed to do. In spite of all the other relationships that we maintain, I think the values is something that we need to uphold, and we need to tell the world that we stand for this and we are very clear about it. With these few words, I would like to conclude, and on behalf of everyone participating today and on behalf of the ICFAI group, I would like to profusely thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful session, and we have learned quite a bit. We will write to you about some of the questions that we still have, and probably hope to seek some response from you. And one day we'll request you to visit our campuses wherever you are. You're traveling more abroad, but I know in Delhi, the closest to Delhi is Gurgaon campus. You've already visited. Just in case you go to your headquarters, the closest is Bangalore and Hyderabad. We can probably catch up at Hyderabad, and you can visit and meet our academic leaders as well as students whenever it's possible. It'll be great to have you and talk to you on our campus at an opportune moment. Thank you very much, ma'am. I want to place on record that it has been a wonderful session, a blockbuster session of sorts in the 65th leadership conversation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you in person.
Great, ma'am. Great. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have now concluded this 65th leadership conversation. We'll meet you again on Friday next, that is on 5th of August at 4 p.m. with yet another leader. Probably we look at gaming as an interesting concern and what lessons that we have for organizations and businesses. Till then, keep reading more about the war that's going on, the stalemate that's continuing between Russia and Ukraine, and the entire world seems to be involved either directly or indirectly. So see you next Friday at 4 p.m. Till then, do take good care of yourself. Bye.